I didn't share a recipe for a year because I felt like such an imposter. Like, who am I to share a recipe? And I had this whole narrative around why I couldn't do that. And first of all, I was making way too big a deal of it because no one was even looking at my website, PS. But also, like, I thought all these things, like, my recipes are too simple and they're not interesting and other people have shared a version of this, And it's funny because now the things that I was so concerned about are the reasons that people love my recipes. So I always like to reflect on that irony of how the things I was telling myself, the reasons that I couldn't do it or I wasn't good enough, have actually been some of the things that have worked the best.
You're listening to The Creative Imposter, episode number 69. Welcome to The Creative Imposter. I'm Andrea Klunder, and today I am bringing you a conversation with Robyn Conley Downs, the producer and host of the Feel Good Effect podcast. Robyn is one of my clients, meaning that I edit her podcast episodes, and I love doing it because my ideal clients are entrepreneurs who are extremely self-motivated, ambitious, and specifically are mission-driven, creating things that have the potential for dynamic social impact. So Robyn definitely fits into that category, and you are going to hear exactly why in this interview. Robyn has been carefully cultivating an online brand and community for the last several years that is all about flipping the script on health and wellness. In fact, her favorite question that she loves to ask all of her podcast guests at the end of her interviews is, what does healthy really mean? And more than just being another food blogger or health and wellness expert, she is all about, as she says, that I, for the life of me, could not repeat during our conversation, the mindset-directed wellness revolution. Did I get that right? And when I say mindset, I mean, sometimes when I hear mindset, I tend to roll my eyes a little bit because it's become one of those buzzwords like mindfulness, like self-care, like so many things in this space that just become overused, watered down, and annoying. But the way that Robyn presents how mindset shifts can help you, whether it comes to health and wellness or business or personal growth, and how it's not just about thinking positive thoughts, you will see why I love editing her show. I mean, I get paid to listen closely to every single word. And in fact, if you enjoy this interview with Robyn as much as I think you will, I'm going to encourage you to go over to her podcast, The Feel Good Effect, and you can also find it on her website at realfoodwholelife.com/FGE. And I want you to go all the way back to the beginning, to episode 1, and you'll hear more of Robyn's personal story about why this mission of creating a mindset-directed wellness revolution, there, I said it, is so important to her, not because she's a guru or an expert, but because of her own personal struggles and experience. Also, I'm going to borrow a tactic from Robyn's podcast and encourage you to listen to this one all the way to the end. At the very end of the interview, Robyn gives us the link to a quiz that you can take on her site, totally free, that will help you discover what your wellness personality type is and how you can leverage that for greater well-being in your life. So look for details and links in the show notes for this episode, number 69, at thecreativeimposter.com/069. And if you love pretty pictures, I'm also going to recommend her Instagram, which you will find in the show notes as well. Here's my conversation with Robyn Conley Downs. Enjoy. Robyn Conley Downs, it is so fun to have you here on The Creative Imposter after working together for almost a year at this point.
Oh my gosh, I'm so happy to talk to you in this context. And it's Andrea Klender from the Creative Imposter Studios, as I say at the end of every episode. So here she is in real life. So much fun.
There's this weird sensation that I'm having right now as I'm listening to your voice in my headphones, which is that my brain thinks that I should be editing your podcast, not actually having a conversation with you.
Well, I was thinking this will be really fun for people to listen to because you have such an insight into my philosophy and the work that I do in a way that very few people do, because you've listened to what I've had to say in this like very meticulous way to put together, a seamless episode. So I'm so excited to dive in.
So for those who may not realize what on earth we're talking about, could you fill us in with just a brief introduction to who you are and what you do and what you are most excited about right now in your life and work?
Absolutely. Okay, so this is such a fun question, and it always pushes me to be able to give the elevator pitch like on cue, right? So my name is Robyn Conley Downs. I am the founder of a wellness lifestyle brand and business, which means that I have a website and a podcast called The Feel Good Effect that we were just talking about. I'm coming out with a self-study guide and a coaching program. So everything kind of lives under this wellness lifestyle umbrella called Real Food Whole Life. And, I came to this point through many years of my own challenges in the health and wellness world. I'd like to add that I didn't come from the wellness world. I came from the academic and research side of things. So I've totally worked in corporate America. I've run large-scale research studies and done the 60-hour week with the child care and the being of the wife and trying to do all the things. And it was actually that experience in those years spent kind of in the hamster wheel that led me to start this whole brand. I still actually do work full time in that space, but I'm transitioning out over the next few months. So we could talk about that too. And what am I most excited about? Well, that is such an easy question for me. I am excited about what I'm calling the mindset directed wellness revolution.
Wait, say that one more time.
I know. I'm like laying it out heavy for you. The mindset directed wellness revolution.
Whoa.
So really flipping the script about what it really means to be healthy.
And so when you decided that you wanted to do something related to health and wellness and that you might want to do this, not just for yourself, but also as work that you want to share, what was the first thing that you did? How did you start?
Yeah, I think it's so good to point out that I did not wake up one day and say to myself, I know exactly what I want to do. Or I didn't say, I know that I want to be the founder of a wellness lifestyle brand. Not at all. That's not what happened. And so you can give yourself so much grace if you're listening and you're like, how did she know? How did she know exactly what she wanted to do? I totally didn't. What I knew at that time, so I'd had a child, I'd had a really difficult pregnancy. I was in my 30s. And I was working full time. I was in a full-time doctoral program for public health. And I was miserable, like really, really crying every morning, kind of miserable, where I looked at myself in the mirror and had no idea how I'd gotten there. And I'd worked so hard in my professional life and my educational background to get to where I was. And then where I was kind of miserable. So I knew I needed to make some changes, and those changes really started with me. They had nothing to do with starting something creative. They really had to do with getting my life back on track and starting with small changes that led to big changes. And through the process of making those changes in my own life, I looked around and I said, I don't see a lot of resources for someone like me who isn't working from home and doesn't have all the resources in the world to work out like 2 hours a day and to plan and prep my meals for 5 hours on the weekend. Like I love that stuff and, take baths with flower petals. And I'm super into that, but it just wasn't real for me. And I felt frustrated that a lot of the recipes I was finding had 20 ingredients and I would kill myself to make them and then my family wouldn't eat them. And so I really just started to try to solve my own problem. And then eventually I felt so compelled to share that because I felt like I had felt so alone and I didn't want other people to feel that way. So that is a long answer to your original question. But I think to make it succinct, I would just say that I felt that through solving my own problem, I could help others who might be going through the same thing.
And then was the food blog, like the recipes and things like that on Real Food Whole Life, was that how you started, or what was the first thing that you started using to share?
So that I did start the website, which is still to this day just like a basic Squarespace site.
But my impression of it, even though it is a basic Squarespace site, is it's so elegantly laid out. And your photography that you feature on there has, I don't even know what the right word is. It just feels really like clean and natural and authentic and relaxing.
Oh, thank you. That is like my Pinterest mood board right there. You nailed it. That's such a compliment. Thank you. I feel like I should have done a better job documenting things along the way because it didn't look like that from day one. And the cool thing about Squarespace is that it can grow with you. And this is, by the way, not a Squarespace commercial. However, I do highly recommend that if you're just like, I want to start something, I want to start a website, it's really user-friendly. It's not a lot to pay for every month, and it lets you change things as you go. So I always kind of recommend that. And Andrea, that reminds me. So I had started with a WordPress site. Mm-hmm. That was so clunky, and I was spending all my time in the tech, and I was just feeling really, really lost and kind of inadequate. And so then I switched to Squarespace really, really early on, and then it's grown with me. So I've been more clear on what my design aesthetic is. I was able to hire a designer after a year and a half. I started practicing photography. So my early pictures do not look like that. They're atrocious. They are really like exactly what you'd expect from someone that doesn't know how to use a camera, is using a flash in the dark, which I do not recommend. So yes, I did start with the website, but I didn't actually start with recipes. I started by sharing like a roundup of other people's recipes. Mm-hmm. So it's like, here's what I'm making. And I would make all these meticulous notes, like here's how to adapt it for a picky eater. And here's how to adapt it for a partner who is really hungry. And, here's all of these things that I'm doing to make this my own. But I wanted to mention that this is the Creative Imposter show. Like, I didn't share a recipe for a year because I felt like such an imposter. Like, who am I to share a recipe? And I had this whole narrative around why I couldn't do that. And first, I was making way too big a deal of it because no one was even looking at my website, PS. But also, like, I thought all these things, like, my recipes are too simple and they're not interesting and other people have shared a version of this, And it's funny because now the things that I was so concerned about are the reasons that people love my recipes because they're so simple and they use few ingredients and their families eat them. So I always like to reflect on that irony of how the things I was telling myself, the reasons that I couldn't do it or I wasn't good enough, have actually been some of the things that have worked the best in the brand.
So I have two questions about that because my mind just went two different directions. One is, I've thought about that with recipes and cookbooks and people who are creating their own recipes because there's a part of me that's like, well, how many different ways can you actually prepare kale? Like how many different kale salad recipes really exist versus just a modification of a modification of a modification that somebody else already did? So my first question is, how do you come up with recipes? And then the second question is, how did you decide to get over that and just publish a freaking recipe?
Okay, so the first question, I think there's two parts to it. So first, in terms of the process, I have always loved creating things with food. I love food. Let's just say that, okay? I love eating. I love thinking about food. Like, that is a high priority for me. And so when I was trying to change my lifestyle, I was like, I need something that tastes good. I need something that fits within my world. And so my kitchen became my laboratory and my family are my guinea pigs. So when I start with an idea, I'm like, okay, I want meatballs tonight, or I want kale, for example. I might get an inspiration for somebody, or I might just know that my daughter likes these 3 flavors right now. And my husband really likes this kind of Italian flavor profile. And then I'll just kind of put those all together for our tastes and for my schedule. I get home at 5. And what I thought I was going to do with that kale doesn't work because I only have 10 minutes to cook. So I'm like, let's try again. Yeah, I think it's a little easier because I do have my own little life to experiment with. And what I've found is when I can run it through that filter, of few ingredients, easy to keep on hand, tastes really good, the family might even eat it, that resonates with my people. And I think that's the second part of your question is, okay, there's really no recipe in the world now that doesn't exist online somewhere. Yeah. And we're getting more saturated by the minute. But I think a lot of people ask me this that are coming into this space, whether it be food or any kind of creative thing where you're like, well, everyone else is doing this, but no one's doing it like you. And I know that that sounds like, oh yeah, whatever, but really no one is doing it like you. And so a lot of times that maybe I'll be inspired by something I've seen someone else do. And then I just say, like, how do I run this through my filter? And what does that look like for Robyn and Real Food Whole Life? And the more I've done it, that process gets a lot easier. And I know exactly what that means. Whereas at the beginning, I didn't really know.
Mm-hmm. That makes so much sense.
And your second question. Oh gosh, I think this has happened more than one time where I finally just get tired of myself. I'm like, okay, you're making a really big deal about this, and it's probably not as big of a deal as you think. A year of taking other people's recipes and creating, and by the way, I wasn't taking them. I always like to mention that too. Don't republish someone else's whole recipe, just link to it. And if you're going to remake it, it needs to be significantly different than the inspiration. But I was linking to these recipes, and over time, I was like, I can do this. I can make recipes like this, because every time I made someone else's recipe, I changed like 90 things. And so I was like, okay, I'll just start. And then once I got to that point, I came up with a really long list of like, well, I don't know food photography and I don't know how to write a recipe. So I bought like 100 books, which is what I always do. Like, I need to research this.
The academic in you.
Totally. Well, I think we can get, depending on your personality type, we can get really stuck in research as a way to procrastinate. So I don't know if that resonates with anyone listening, but I was using that as a way to not do the work. And so kind of had to move through those stages. And then I started doing it. And it was really painful because it wasn't good. And I'm a perfectionist. And I didn't realize that. The blog and the brand have taught me more about myself and about my perfectionism than anything else has in my life. But I had to be able to sit there in that uncomfortable place and be like, this is not as good as I want it to be. And that's okay.
And so how long ago did you start the Real Food Whole Life website?
4 years ago. Yeah. So that whole first year was sharing other people's recipes. That was a year. And my mindset was like, I'm just going to, I love that wording, right? I'm just going to, like, I was so meek about it. Like, I'm not a blogger. Like, I just have this little website. And then the second year I started doing recipes, but it was still a very apologetic, like, well, I do this thing, but it's not really a thing, like, I don't know what I'm doing. I would say that all the time. I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know how to do this. And then I would say 2 years ago, I was like, hey, I'm either going to do this or not. This is taking a lot of time for something that quote unquote doesn't matter. Mm-hmm. And I kind of flipped the switch in my mind and said, like, I am a blogger. I'm doing this. I'm going to make this a business. And I'm going to keep working through this uncomfortable place where I could be better, but I'm doing the best I can right now.
And then, so the Feel Good Effect podcast came about last year in 2017. Is that sort of the next major piece of the brand, or is there something in between?
I would say there's a few things in between, like building social media community kind of fits in there. I didn't do that right away. It didn't, again, all the feelings of imposter syndrome keeping me off of social media. And I felt weird about being self-promoting and all the things I think creatives say. Like, I don't want to have to sell. I don't like social media. It's scary to interact with humans, or maybe that's just me too, but kind of all the ways we kind of hold ourselves back. And then I did launch a paid product, my first paid product, about a year or maybe 2 years ago now. So that was a big step to say, I'm going to make this a business. I'm going to create something that people want, that can add value to their lives, and that can help me sustain a business. And then, the Feel Good Effect podcast was a brainchild starting in early January of last year, so 2017. And again, one of those things where I would just whisper, like, in my head. Mm-hmm. I wouldn't even say it out loud. And then I finally said it out loud to a couple of people. And I was like, you know what? This is so right. I can't not do it.
Why a podcast? What was it about podcasting that made you think, yes, this is definitely something I need to add into my mix?
That's a really good question, because I think right now a lot of people in the sort of online entrepreneurial or online creator space feel like they have to do everything.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, because there's always something new to add. It's like, oh, by the way, do you have a YouTube channel? And oh, by the way, do you have a podcast? And oh, by the way, like I get so bogged down sometimes. But I think it's important to know that podcasting isn't just another thing. It's not another social media channel. It's its own content platform. I was drawn to it, first of all, because I'm an avid podcast listener. Like I always have earbuds in for, I don't know, several years. I say that I went to I got my MBA in podcast university.
Seriously.
For real though, everything I know I've learned on a podcast. And my husband teases me. He's like, oh wait, did you hear that on a podcast? And I'm like, I did.
I was listening to this podcast the other day and they were talking about that's like 90% of my conversations start that way.
Me too. And I feel like our listeners are like, yeah, hello. It's the best way. And so I had been consuming and never thinking about doing it myself. And then I think what happened was I was feeling this tension between who I was professionally and my educational professional background and who I was as a brand and business owner. And they didn't merge at all. And at a certain point, a light bulb went off and I realized that I could take my experience as an educator and as a teacher and as a researcher, and I could combine that with my interest in the wellness space and my insights into what it was like to experience a transformation myself. And that the best platform to deliver that really was podcasting. And once that came together for me, like that was a light bulb moment. I have very few examples in my life where I've had such clarity, but that was one of them.
And then what do you think were the biggest challenges from the time that you had the idea in the beginning of 2017 to the time that you launched in, I want to say it was August of 2017 that you launched?
I think it was June.
Was it June? Okay.
Yeah, it's coming up, like our anniversary.
1 year anniversary.
My anniversary with you is coming up. Yeah. What were the biggest challenges? Two things. One is about mindset and one is about actual physical, logistical challenges. The tech and the learning curve for podcasting is steep. It really is at this point. I mean, if you're listening to this in 5 years, I don't think it'll be the same way. But right now, the entry is a little bit challenging technically. And I would start watching YouTube videos and get so discouraged and so overwhelmed. And then that's the mindset piece. Like I started telling myself again, I don't know how to do this. What am I even thinking? Like, who do I think I am to have a podcast? Like, I don't know tech. I don't blah, 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 blah. All this stuff in my brain holding me back. And so I did make a decision. We should talk about this too, about hiring an editor. But before I made that decision, I really decided to take a step back and be like, is this really about the tech or is this just about being afraid to put yourself out there?
Ooh, that's a good one, Robyn.
When people ask you what microphone they need and they're like so hung up on what microphone they should buy. Yeah. And you're like, I totally understand what you're saying, but the microphone is not the thing that's going to be what makes or breaks this whole situation.
Yeah. Yeah, it is. And tech is definitely, it's like the biggest question people always start with. And the tech is fine. Like, it's definitely not something to be like, oh, it's no big deal, but it's not the thing. So yes, please tell me more. Yeah,
I remember it seeming like such a huge block. And this is so funny. I was listening to a podcast recently with Seth Godin, his Akimbo podcast, which I am really, really into. I would highly recommend you guys check that one out too. And he was telling a story about Stephen King and a writer's workshop that he attends and somebody asking him, what kind of pen do you use when you write? And he's like, so it's not about the pen, it's about sitting down and writing. And I think with podcasting, it's the same thing. Like, get a $50 mic, plug it in. You don't even need a mixer and use GarageBand or SoundCloud or whatever. And actually just see what it would be like to record something and then record something else and see if you like it, see if you have something to say. And if you do, then keep going and then start adding the technical pieces on top and then see if you need to recruit help too, because you don't have to do it all by yourself.
Yeah. And that's, in full disclosure, that is how our relationship came to be, was because you were looking into how to find an editor to work with. I don't even remember if it came from a referral or from a post in a Facebook group.
I feel like it was Facebook group.
Okay. And one thing that, and I hope that it's okay that I say this, and if it's not okay, you can tell me and I'll take it out. But one thing is that when I edit shows for other clients, I have access to everyone's account where all their media files are. And that means I can see everyone's download numbers in terms of how many people are downloading and listening to the show. And I'm not going to give away Robyn's numbers publicly, but I know, Robyn, that you, for being a year in, have very high download numbers comparatively. And when you listen to stats reports of like industry averages, I would say your numbers are in the top 20% of all podcasts that are measured by our hosting company, Libsyn. And I'm curious as to, like, when I say that, how does that feel to you, or what does that make you think of?
It's a really good question. And the numbers thing in this industry is hard because there are a million ways that you get ranked and you get quantified. And the podcast downloads is just one more thing on the list of the ways that when I go through a week, I get counted and quantified. So I think there's two things. The first is to not mistake one number for everything. Mm-hmm. And so a download means one thing, but it doesn't measure an impact. It doesn't measure a cultural change. It doesn't measure a mindset shift. And I have to remind myself of that every single day because it can get really impersonal and it can get really competitive and it can be really like, oh, well, this week I was this high and I was in this top 20 last week and now I'm not even in the rankings. And so started her podcast after me and she's already ahead of me. Like this whole nonsensical thing that we do. And I know why. I know why we do it.
Why?
Why
do we do it?
I think because we want to know that we're doing a good job. Mm-hmm. I think we want to know that our work, that what we're doing matters. And the only way that we're given to measure that is a download number. Mm. And so we actually have to work really hard to broaden the scope of what success means, whether it's a podcast or whatever your creative work looks like. And then the other thing I was going to say about that is it's great when you can crack, like, if you can get into the top 200 in your category or the top 100 or the top 20, you get more access to guests. Like things happen for you that wouldn't happen otherwise. So there is some benefit to it. But I would say that it's like a never enough scenario because you think, well, I'll be happy when I have X number of listeners, or I'll be happy when I crack 200, or I'll be happy when. And the thing that I've learned in this 4-year process, as I've built an Instagram following or community, or I've done the podcast, like that does not actually pan out. You're not happy when you hit the number or you get the thing and you're like, oh, well, what's next? Or it's not actually good enough. Like there's no winning in that game. And the sooner we can step out of that, the more fulfilling, the more satisfying, and the more impact that we can make.
Numbers are one thing, and they're one measure that we have to go by, but you mentioned impact. How do you measure success for yourself and impact? What goes into that?
Oh, I would say that's an evolving question, especially podcasting is so difficult because you don't get a lot of feedback. You know, when people leave an actual review, that's helpful. When people email me, and luckily I do have the Instagram account, so I will get more in-depth conversation there, either through a comment or a DM where someone said, like, this has really changed the way I've been thinking, or this changed my year, you know, and I'm like, okay, I actually have to take a moment and let that sink in. Andrea, you probably know this. So I have an episode with Rick Hansen, who is a psychologist and neuroscientist, and he studies mindfulness. And in this episode, we talk about how our brains are wired, you know, negativity bias, which you may have heard, right? So all this information comes to us all day long, and the things that stick are the bad things or the negative. We're like little Velcro balls just attracting the negativity. And that's just how our brain works. Like there's no good or bad, that's just it. But we can train our brains to also accept the good things and the amazing things, but we actually have to work a little harder. So when I do get that information, whether it's like through an email or a DM or a review, I actually pause, soak it in, and like let that be something really good. And then on top of that, I have to really work on kind of flipping goals. And so when I say that, like goal flipping just means focusing on the process over the end result and letting the actual creative process be a reward in itself. And again, that's something I practice. Like it's not a normal, natural thing that came to me, but I have to say, like, I enjoy recording this podcast. I love talking to these people. I crave the community that this is creating, even if that for you is like 50 or 200 people, and letting the process and the daily and the little tiny bits be what fulfills me, what keeps me going, what makes this a job worth doing.
I think that's really important. And I know that it's so hard. Even myself, it's like I grew up having a very difficult time actually receiving compliments and actually like hearing people when they would, for whatever it was. Like obviously it didn't used to always be podcasting or anything like that. But, you know, I even grew up performing and singing in my church, and people would compliment me on whatever song I sang during the service. And I just was like so uncomfortable. And it happens sometimes too. You know, even now someone will say to me, "Oh my God, Andrea, that interview that you did with Robyn, it really just meant so much to me. And I loved this insight, and it really made me think about things in a new way." And there's this part of me that just wants to deflect it and be like, "Oh yeah, great," you know, or something, you know, some really weird thing. And I think that it sometimes can be a challenge for people to really hear that your work is making a difference and to really own it. And that's part of the imposter syndrome too, is even when you do get positive feedback and even when you are making a difference and you see evidence of it, it can be hard to really take ownership for that.
Yeah. And it's more than just accepting a compliment. It's about letting the meaning soak into your consciousness, which sounds woo, but it's not actually woo. It's like so neuroscience, guys, that if you go through the day and you brush off every piece of input or data that tells you that you're on the right track, that you're doing a good job, then you're missing out on reality. And you are missing out on people who are trying to share their experience with you. I mean, that's the thing when I get a comment from someone like that. I just take a moment to reflect some gratitude that they could receive my contribution. And not everybody's going to be moved by what I have to say. Not everybody's going to be on this mindset-directed wellness revolution train, and that's fine. But for the people who are ready to hear it, that's just something I want to celebrate.
Mindset directive revolution. Say that phrase one more time.
Yeah, mindset directive wellness revolution.
Tell me more about this concept. What does it mean? So we've talked about it in terms of entrepreneurship, and we've talked about, you know, flipping things in terms of podcasting and entrepreneurship, but tell me what it means in terms of health and wellness.
Yeah, and it's actually similar. So mindset, people throw the concept or the term around a lot, and sometimes it's used accurately and sometimes it's not. So I always kind of love to give a little insight because it applies as much as it does to wellness, it does to the entrepreneurial space, the creative space. So a lot of people have heard of Carol Dweck's work around mindset, and she talks about growth versus fixed mindset. And she has a great TED Talk and a book, but I can summarize it in like 1 or 2 sentences for you. So her work focused on student learning and kind of 2 groups of students who perceived their ability to learn as like sort of incapable of learning, and those who thought they were capable. So it was their perception. So one set of students who had a fixed mindset said, "I can't do this." And the growth mindset group would say, "I can't do this yet." And so what we've done, the work that we're doing at Real Food Whole Life, is to say, okay, well, what does that fixed mindset look like for wellness? And then what does that growth mindset look like in wellness? And so it's really about shining the light on the ways our brains filter information and the kind of decisions that we make based on that information. So mindset isn't about thinking positively or being optimistic. It's about being a little more proactive over how you filter the information that you receive. And I think it helps, again, with wellness to think of some specific examples, but maybe this applies to creativity and to entrepreneurship as well. Like there's sort of these different lies that we believe. For example, it has to be perfect, or everything that I do matters equally, or growth has to be linear and level. So those are some of the things we've found through our research, that we tell ourselves these things so often that they just become part of our brain. And that's the information we use to make decisions. But the good thing is that you can actually change and rewire so that you have a different set of criteria that you're applying when you're trying to make a decision. So it's similar, like we're kind of formatting and formulating the feel good mindset, which is asking questions more about, does this feel really good? Does this align with my values? Does this make my day better? And so it's not about focusing on self-indulgence. It's just about saying, how can I get out of that place where I'm so limited by some of the limiting beliefs I have and step into this other kind of way of thinking?
And so speaking of mindset and changing the way that you're thinking about things, one of the things that I really admire about you, and this is just my own perception based upon the fact that you are so consistent with deadlines. You are more consistent than I am with podcast episodes. And you mentioned earlier that part of your message and part of your brand is really about things that are practical for your lifestyle, that don't involve having 5 hours on weekends to meal plan and having you're at home. And so you can spend 2.5 hours working out or whatever it is, or you can go to the gym midday when no one's there, whatever. And I know, you are a mom of an adorable child. And I only say adorable because I have heard her voice on your podcast a couple of times, which I love every time she makes a guest appearance. And you have, a family and a husband, and you have a full-time job still, and you make this blog, and you just finished yoga teacher training, and you have the podcast. How do you balance all of these things and manage your time in a way that feels healthy and nourishing and not like you're constantly overworking yourself? Or are you overworking yourself?
Well, so we have one of our favorite things that we've done. And when I say we, my husband is a clinical psychologist and focused on wellness. So we've kind of teamed up as research partners, and we've created these different wellness personality types. We did all the survey research around the different ways that people perceived health and their ability to be healthy and to live healthy. And what we found was people fell into these 3 distinct groups. Okay, so we have, and you can take the quiz. So I'm going to plug the quiz here.
Mm-hmm. And we will link to it in the show notes for this episode.
Yep, it's free, realfoodwholelife.com/quiz. And it's 5 questions. So we are able to sort people into these categories pretty efficiently. And there are 3 types, which I can kind of run down. And this, I will answer your question, but I wanted to tell you, you might be able to guess my personality type as I'm describing them. So we found that people generally fall into one of 3 categories. So these are kind of like if you've done Strengths Finders or one of those personality type metrics, you can understand, oh, well, here's the things that I am really good at, and here's some of the things that maybe have been challenging. So when applied to wellness, there's the dynamo. So the dynamo tends to be a perfectionist, maybe a little bit type A. I know people who are in this category who are really competitive athletes or really good students, or you can be type A or perfectionist, I always like to say, even without having a perfectly clean home or car. But you apply yourself in this way where you tend toward all or nothing kind of thinking, and you push yourself really hard. So that's one category. Then we have the seekers, and the seekers tend to be really looking outside of themselves at what other people are doing. So they tend to maybe fall into the comparison trap or just kind of trying a bunch of things. So with wellness, maybe they've done the Whole30 and they finished the Whole30 and they're like, oh, but now I want to try keto. And then they do that and they're like, oh, that didn't work. So now I'm going to try carb counting or whatever the new thing is. So hopping from thing to thing, but they're never able to find what really works, what really sticks. And so they often feel like they're just not doing a good job, even though they're trying so hard. And then the cultivator is sort of the person who may be brand new to wellness. So they've had a life transition or a life change that has brought them to focus on their health, or maybe they used to do it and they had something happen, or many years, raising children or working a full-time job, and they lost touch with that side of them, and now they're coming back to it. So they maybe just feel overwhelmed. They just want someone to tell them what to do, give me the guide, tell me what to do, right? So we have these 3 categories. I fall into the dynamo category. And so doing this work was really interesting for me because I think when you're one type, you think everyone else is like you too. And so it's been very useful for me to understand where I am and how I'm similar to some people, but not all people. So my biggest challenge is that perfectionism. It is pushing really hard. It is like piling all the things on the plate and not remembering to take anything off. So that is something I'm always being careful of, Andrea.
So totally relate.
Yeah, and it can be really good, pushing and challenging yourself and doing things outside of your comfort zone can be awesome. But being mindful about when it starts to have a negative impact and starts to drag you down, and when you feel drained and you feel unbalanced, those are all really good indicators that that part of you, that dynamo part of you, is getting in the way of making really good choices. So I try to use our feel-good test, as I was kind of talking about before, and apply that test as like a decision rule to the things that I'm doing. And that's been a learning process as well, because before I was just like, just do more. I had no way of filtering. As I've learned through these years to apply the feel-good test and ask this question, does this feel good? Does this make my day better? Does this contribute to my values and who I want to be? I am better able to take things off the plate and to say no. So when people ask me, like, how are you doing it all? I like to remind them that I say no to like 95% of things that come my way. I don't watch a lot of TV. I don't spend a lot of time on social media other than when I'm there, for my work. Like, there's just a lot of things I don't do. I get up really early because that's important to me. I try to emphasize, just because I do something in some way doesn't mean you have to. It's what's right for me. And that's where I try to circle around. It's like, does this feel good to me? Is this based on my values? Not because someone else told me I had to, and not because I'm compelled to do it perfectly.
So what is your best advice for someone who is really sick of themselves and they are ready to make a mindset shift, whether it comes to something creative, whether it comes to entrepreneurship or work, or whether it comes to health and wellness? What's your best advice for that person who's like, yes, this is the moment. I'm going to make a change. I'm going to do something different.
Oh, I love that question. This is my favorite group, honestly. When you're like, I know that this is something that's important to me, and I believe in you. I just want to tell you right now, I don't know you, but I do believe that you can do this. So here is my wisdom. Take what you need and leave what you don't. That's always what I like to say before I give any advice. So one, you have to be a beginner to start. And I think that that's a really good thing to keep in mind when you start something. There's no way to bypass being a beginner. And so being okay in that messy middle where you know where you want to be and you're not there yet. And just be there. Know that that's totally normal. Which leads me to 2, focusing on the process over goals. And again, back to that goal flipping episode. I think it can get daunting where you're looking ahead and you have all these goals and you're not there. So you're like in this failure state on a daily basis. But finding ways to make the daily act of creating, making that enough. So whether that's adding joy or finding ways to make it easy, or letting go of perfectionism. Process over goals is something we can practice and get better at. 3, be you. I think we've talked about that on the show already, but there's no one like you. And it sometimes takes a while to figure out what that even means, but there's no way to know until you do the work, which leads me to number 4, do the work. This is so important. I don't know if you guys have read Stephen Pressfield's War of Art. Mm-hmm. Have you read that, Andrea?
Yes.
It's a little agro-masculine for me, but what I love is that he talks about the resistance, the feeling that you feel when you know that you want to do something, you know it's right, but you're just not doing it. And at the end of the day, sit down and do the work, capital T, capital W. Close all of the browsers. One browser window open. Put your phone away. Turn off all the distractions and do the work. that's the hardest thing, right? But really be honest with yourself. That's my tough love. Like if you're really, really, really want to do it, like give yourself at least an hour and do the work. And then the last piece of advice is a little more pragmatic, which is we could have a whole other conversation about this, but lean into marketing and know that you actually have to learn how to connect with a tribe and to share what you've created at some point, unless you are purely doing it for yourself, in which case that's cool. But if you're trying to grow something or share something, the marketing side was something that I was really scared of for a long time and I had a lot of bias against. And the more that I've tried to learn about that and to try to make it my own, the better success that I've had. So that's kind of the pragmatic side of things.
Marketing.
Yeah. No, but seriously, like I get that from almost like 99.9% of creatives. And I get that from everyone I've ever worked with in academics. And I think it just feels, well, like, why do you say that, Andrea? Tell me. Let's flip this interview around.
I don't know. I talked about this in some episode recently of like, particularly email marketing, particularly writing and sending my email newsletters. First of all, even calling it a newsletter feels like I want to stick my thumb in my eye. And I keep trying to call it something different, but I keep defaulting to newsletter. And second, it takes me like 10 minutes to do. It's not that big a deal. But for some reason, every time I think about sending out an email, I just have this huge like thing, like I'm imposing or I'm just adding to the noise, even though I know that people want the information that's in there. But it's just like, oh, I'm just adding to the clutter in everyone's inbox. And does it even matter anyways? And why am I doing this? And I don't know. That's the stuff that brings up my imposter voices. Nobody wants this email from me.
Yeah. No, that's so common. I would say that is hand in hand with maybe that state. We could do like the stages of grief, only the stages of creative imposter syndrome.
I love it.
Once you get past the creating part, then you get into imposter syndrome around marketing. And we aren't going to be able to go into that into depth, but I would tell people to sit with that a little. Like all the things that you just said are probably things that you felt when you were first starting this podcast or your website or a bunch of other things. And you somehow found a way to move through that. And maybe it's not just like continuing to send emails, but it is how do I connect with people and give them and let them know what I am creating. And really, if email marketing and at the end of the day feels weird and spammy, like then don't do it. But if there's those limitations in your mind around marketing, I think that is one of the biggest hangups for creatives. And it makes me really sad because I feel like there are so many of you out there that have something to give and something to share. And you spend all of your time on creating it and none of the time getting it out to people. And that I am only saying that from my own experience. That last piece of advice is one to like sit with and maybe think a little more about.
Okay, last question. Is there anything else that you want to say before we part ways that you didn't get a chance to say or you just feel like has been unsaid?
I feel like I said a lot. I would just kind of come back to some of those main points about honing in on who you are, what works for you, what brings you joy, what brings you ease, letting go of perfection, and finding ways to practice that and make it the center of your life so that you can enjoy the daily process, so that this experience of being a creative person, of moving through the world and finding health and all those things can actually be fulfilling and not draining. So I hope that I can, inspire that conversation, provide some strategies, and just encourage you.
Don't you just feel so much better after hearing that conversation with Robyn? So there are a few resources that she mentioned, one of which is the Wellness Personality Quiz that she and her husband created, which you can find at realfoodwholelife.com/quiz. Linked along with all of these other resources in the show notes for this episode at thecreativeimposter.com/069. Also, the Feel Good Effect podcast. Remember, go back and listen to episode 1. It's really good and sets up the whole premise for everything that Robyn is doing with her brand. She mentioned her recent interview with Rick Hansen. That's a good one. And also Seth Godin's new podcast, Akimbo, which I will link to because I am also likewise obsessed with listening. And she also mentioned a book called The War of Art with Stephen Pressfield. And I love and hate this book at the same time. I really have gotten a lot out of it. And something that really has resonated with me from Stephen Pressfield's work is this idea of resistance that we meet every time we're trying to create something really important. In fact, I recorded an episode of The Creative Imposter a long while back all about this, and I encourage you to check that out. It is episode number 11, and it's called Resistance. If you are listening to this episode and feel like you know of someone else who might like to hear the wisdom that Robyn shares, please share this episode with that person. It's so easy to do right from your app, especially if you're listening in Apple Podcasts. Just simply click the little circle with the ... and then share, and it gives you a whole bunch of options for ways that you can share this episode, which was mixed, as always, by Edwin Ruiz of Mondo Machine. Our theme music is by Jovia Armstrong. I thank you so much for listening, and this week I am giving you permission to flip the script, focus on process over results, and to define for yourself what it really means to be healthy.